said it. I've already said it. All right, everyone, if we can begin to sit down, we're going to begin the concluding discussions. If we can wrap it up, return to our seats. All right. Welcome to the conclusion discussion. It is my immense pleasure to introduce my mentor and supervisor, Dr. Douglas Hedley. He will be moderating our conclusion discussion tonight. Dr. Hedley is professor of the philosophy of religion here at the University of Cambridge. He specializes in Neoplatonism, the Cambridge Platonists, and aspects of romantic and idealistic thought. His monographs include The Iconic Imagination, Sacrifice Imagined, Living Forms of the Imagination, Aids to Reflection, and The Mirror of the Spirit, Coleridge, Philosophy and Religion. He's also the principal investigator of a UK Arts and Humanities Research Council grant on revisioning Cambridge Platonism. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hedley and the rest of the panelists.
Well, before we start business, I've been asked to note that at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, sharp, there will be services at St. Bennett's and at Fisher House. And at 10 a.m., there will be a service at St. Athanasius, the Orthodox Church here in Cambridge.
There's also a liturgy at 8 o'clock at St. Clement's. Orthodox liturgy at St. Clement's.
So 8 o'clock, possibly not sharp, but 8 o'clock, there will be a liturgy at St. Clement's. Yep, thank you, Aaron. Great. Well, shall we begin then, now having sorted out tomorrow morning prior to the conference, perhaps questions for our speakers?
This is principally a question for Dr. Betz. Earlier in your discussion of like ecstasy in the Trinity and in life, you were sort of talking about the nature of the self as being ecstatic and going out towards the other, and there was some sort of concern maybe that wasn't an emphasis on substance there as a sort of necessary corollary. And that's sort of what my question is, just to maybe press you more on that, because it seems like that, you know, for true self-giving, right, you need a sort of content to give, which of course can't be developed without the other, right? But that there needs to be a sense of, and that, you know, you can't actually grow into being a self, you know, without this constant action, but that there is a sort of primordial given, so to speak. And sort of seems like someone like von Balthasar, when he's talking about the dialogic and theologic one, kind of seems to me say something like this. He kind of keeps both poles. Are you still envisioning keeping both of those poles, or I guess that was just kind of...
Yes. Yes, I mean, one must be given in order to give oneself away, right? The Son himself can only give himself back to the Father, having received himself from the Father. So yes, in that sense, I agree with everything you're saying. So the only thing I would add to that is that the more one gives oneself away, the more of a true self one becomes. At least if we take seriously what Christ says in the gospel, you know, he who loses his life for my sake will find it, right? So that suggests to me that there is a true self at the end of that way, and that we don't really begin with the truest self, but that the truest self is at the other end of the way which Christ himself is. So that would be my answer. You could look at it in light of what Paul says, going from glory to glory, going from selfhood to selfhood. So we're talking analogically along the spectrum. And again, I would say that Christ is the primary analogate of all selfhood, of all humanity. So one begins with a given self, but that self, in turn, as it's perfected, is entering more and more truly into its essence, which is found only in Christ. So that would be my answer. So there is a content that is given, but yet paradoxically, the true self is not yet there. You could even look at this in terms of entelekes. I mean, something that is given with an order, with a telos, with an end. So I think it might even be helpful to think of subjectivity in terms of entelekes, to use an older term. Yeah. But that's my answer.
Barbara, would you like to intervene?
No, I would like to ask a question myself.
Okay.
But to everybody, not only to us here on the podium, just an observation and a question. So I feel that we really did not very often touch the concept of person. And I'm a little bit astonished and want to know why. So if the person, when we follow St. Thomas, and maybe the Dominicans here present, they know better by heart the precise formulation. St. Thomas says the person is the highest ontological reality. Shouldn't we enter in clarifying, together with ontology, the concept of person in a new way? So, and as the dogma is presented to us as nature and person, we should try to work it out. Maybe the topic of ontology forces us to stay with this part of the concept. But I just want us to include the notion of person here in our reflection.
Yes.
Perhaps this does follow on from that in some sense, because what I'd like to ask the panel is if they see any distinction between a Trinitarian ontology, which obviously Father Louth denied in some of the Middle Byzantine fathers, and an ontology of participation in God, generally speaking, or in some mode that might not be Trinitarian. So, is there a difference between a Trinitarian ontology and an ontology of participation in God? And if so, what would that distinction be?
I can say straight away, read Richard Price, who is a Unitarian but a Platonist. Or many Muslim thinkers as well, but anyway, it's another story. We have a question here, I think.
I think I heard the word Muslim, and I want to ask a very general question. So Christianity is not the only theistic religion. We have Judaism and we have Islam, with great theologians and philosophers in both of these traditions. So if God is Trinitarian, what would you say is the relationship between these non-Christian religions and the truth of the Trinitarian nature of God? I can't imagine that the creator of us all made these other religions blind to his true nature. So I want to hope that there is a way for a Muslim, for example, to understand the Trinity while remaining a good Muslim, and the same perhaps for Jews. It's a general question. I don't know who would like to answer it.
There is, of course, a long tradition of seeing elements of the Trinity in pagan thought, particularly in Platonism. That's there, obviously, in the Fathers, but in the Cambridge Platonists as well. They're absolutely adamant that the doctrine of the Trinity is distinctive in Christianity, but it has a distinct analogy with triadic models of reality in the books of the Platonists.
Yeah, perhaps to answer to this question, I think you can start with revelation. What is revelation? And if Muslims really believe in revelation, then they know, or even they confess, that the content of revelation is something divine. So you find in the Quran verses saying, al-Kitab, which means that there's a mother of all scripture, and the Quran in our hands is like a copy of this eternal word, eternal Quran, where this is then the big question, dwells within God or is with God in some way. So if you want to understand revelation of the self-communication of God, then you come at least to a certain duality. There's God and then even the content of revelation. And then you need even a divine guarantee that this revelation is really understood as God meant it. And there, even in Muslims traditions, you find the role of the Spirit, which makes possible to understand correctly the divine revelation of God, and then you come to some elements of the Trinity. And even there are discussions going on in Germany, for instance, among Muslim students and professors and Christians, speaking about the creation. So if God is just one, how then is it possible to have the difference between God and something which is not God? And there are some Muslims, theologians, thinking that at least there's an eternal idea of creation in God, to have a certain difference in God, between God and something else. Otherwise, it gets very difficult to understand how the difference between God and creation is possible in the case that God just has nothing to do with any kind of difference. And these are actual reflections going on, I know at least. On the other hand, Muslims know very well our attempts to explain the Trinity, beginning with the attributes of God, so that you have the wisdom for the Son or the love for the Spirit. And then they criticize us, saying, well, you're a bit stupid, Christians. You need persons, hypostases, to understand what these attributes want to say. It's a crude form of representation of the attributes. So even this is their critique. You find it in Al-Ghazali, for instance, or other authors, which shows even the difficulty to develop a Trinity, only starting with the attributes of God, which with the result that at the end the attributes of God just receive a certain personalistic illustration, which then is the point of critique of the Muslims.
Maybe I can just affirm that our conference might be considered as a valuable contribution to Christian-Muslim dialogue. Because in my opinion, we are in a situation where we normally affirm that we are all monotheistic religions. So, and as long as Christians see their Trinitarian theology only as a positive dogma that you have to sign and then forget it because it has no signification for your all day's life, you will not be able to enter in a dialogue about this situation. What we discover here is that it has large consequences for everything we see in the whole world. It's a whole world view. And at this moment, if we as Christians are able again to confirm monotheism, but to explain why our Christian Trinitarian ontology is the way that how we confess our monotheism, we will be able to enter in dialogue. And there will be a lot of hard work, but I think they will better understand us, our brothers and sisters, when we are able to communicate what we try to discover here.
My point has to do with anthropology. Charles Sanders Peirce developed the idea of threeness, and he had also within language the idea of icon, index, icon, and symbol. And I think that understanding of semiotics is quite helpful because it can be understood in a quite a secular way, in a way that may make sense to other religious traditions as well as Christianity. And so therefore that idea of threeness can be woven into a broader understanding of how there can be Trinitarian relationships, if you like, that are not necessarily understood in Christian terminology. And Andrew Robinson has actually written a very interesting book on the Trinity and the philosophy of Charles Sanders Peirce, which could be useful for something like that. He hasn't, I don't think, engaged explicitly in dialogue with Muslim traditions, but I would have thought that by opening up the anthropological and the psychological issues, that then allows a kind of mediating concept so that there isn't quite such a confrontation between a Christology and a different understanding of Christ as a divine prophet or something. So there's a gap there that needs navigating.
So, Jessica.
Thank you. This is kind of related, inspired by the last question, and perhaps it's completely bonkers, so feel free to ignore. But this question about the plurality within God, inspired by the need for there to be an interrelationality, because without relationality, some of the most beautiful and important things that can exist can only have that. So God, if he's going to create anything worthwhile, has to have an interrelationality. And maybe indeed it has to be a personal interrelationality for those fine, beautiful things to be. Look, plenty of religions kind of get that, as we're saying. Hinduism gets it. If you look at Ibn Arabi, he has forces within the divine that take on a semi-autonomous kind of character. There are other models that approximate this. So then Hindus have sometimes said to me, Jesus' incarnation, definitely true. Jesus, Son of God, no problem. Jesus, definitely God coming into time and history, no problem. But why only once? And why so sad? Which actually I think is kind of an interesting question. So, I mean, there's lots implied in that. My question will simply be, could God have incarnated just to enjoy? Or is it always only to do with the fall? Could God have said, you know what, this is going to be even better, there's going to be even more rich relationality and creation of the world if I become a time-bound physical form, go through all that stuff. That's going to be great. I'm going to do that. It will improve creation. Or is it always to do with something that is about healing a problem that history and free will create in the fall?
I have a quick question for Jessica, actually, while people are waiting, pondering that very difficult question. There's not just a question of the relation to other monotheistic, one might say Unitarian faiths, but there is the intriguing phenomenon of the Trimurti in Hinduism. Would you like to say something about that threefold deity that fascinated some of our ancestors in India? I'm thinking particularly of Sir William Jones and others.
Yeah. I'm going to shift that slightly. Hinduism has a kind of a Trimurti, although actually they came up, the missionaries kept saying, how many gods have you got? And they'd be like, so many. And then after a while they were like, 3? Does that sound better to you guys? And they kind of stuck together Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and it kind of put them into a form, which is interesting, but actually not very widely held as a theological concept amongst most Hindus, I think. What you do get is, and anyone interested can look into it, but in a branch of Hinduism called Kashmiri Shaivism, you get the idea that the divine, because it's consciousness, because consciousness is part of being, it has to develop an otherness, which has then to relate to itself in a relation which is characterized not only as self-awareness, but as enjoyment. So there's both consciousness and qualitative emotional content to it. And I think that's very similar. So, I mean, maybe the best way to ask the question would just be like, can you guys vote? Like, who says Jesus could have happened as God having fun?
Yes.
And who says it couldn't?
God at play.
So first of all, I think we should become aware that several interesting questions come from interreligious dialogue now. And that's an important sign. We have to be aware of it. I will try to give only a direction for an answer, and a very radical one. So, why only once? Because the incarnation is the personalization of the whole reality, and this is only possible in and by God. The second is because we all are the second ones in Christ, and we all will personalize, or are called to personalize, not just one God beside the others, but the whole of reality. And it's among these wholes that the dialogue and the communion is established. And I think in this sense, the Christian revelation is the most radical one, but is able to dialogue, as you showed, with other religions, and maybe to radicalize their approach.
Yes, please.
Okay, I think that's a very interesting question, but actually some people working in the area of ecology and multi-species have actually thought about this quite extensively. So Dennis Edwards, who unfortunately passed away this year, uses quite traditional sources to argue that actually the incarnation is a fundamental significance, not necessarily just the passion narrative. So in other words, Christ came because Christ needed to become incarnate in the world, regardless of whether there was any sin. So that is actually a contemporary theological view. There are others who maybe follow other traditional sources that will want to stress the fall aspect. But I think there is a diversity of opinion within contemporary theological thought. There's also some theologians who are prepared to go even more radical than that and say that God could have become a different kind of animal, or and also the image of God is in other creatures as well. So it depends how liberalized you're prepared to go as to how far you can do that. So it's not outside the Christian theological discourse to do this kind of experimental work. So I would say that in that sense, there's room for an exchange. How far you find those views convincing. I personally don't think, I would rather go for what I call Niels Gregerson's deep incarnation view, which means that Christ's significance is significant in relation to the whole of creation, but that doesn't mean that everything is becoming incarnate. There is a distinction, but there's also a universality to it. So there's a depth of significance for all of creation and not just humanity, because the tendency within Christian thought has been to narrow it down so much that it only matters to humanity and not the rest of the natural world, and I think that's a mistake. So that's where people are beginning to push, but you can still push that within a more traditional view, but we need to sort of expand the scope, if you like, or the significance of the incarnation.
We now have 3 questions at once. Here, then over there.
I need to get Andrew in.
Yeah, a question particularly also to Andrew Louth. I wondered today if the terminology Trinitarian Ontology has some ambiguity. It can mean an ontology about the Trinity in itself, an ontological account of the Trinity, but it can also mean, and this is closer to Nicholas of Cusa, who was also very apophatic and very careful not to talk about the being of the Trinity in itself. In how far does the Trinity imply a transformative dimension that changes our understanding what being means and reveals a kind of responsive dimension of and personal dimension in our creation that is not self-evident in pre-Christian traditions? And if you put this question in this way, it might still be possible to talk about the Trinitarian ontology in view of the Church Fathers.
First of all, could I just thank you for your paper, which I found very fascinating. and I'd like to talk to about, not here, but about it. Now, I find myself wanting to make distinctions. The question that was asked, not really answered a bit earlier, about the difference between a Trinitarian ontology and a notion of participation. Somebody raised that. It seems to me that there are lots of other reasons for thinking in terms of three than the Trinity. And lots of people do think in terms of three. I mean, Neoplatonism, primarily, I think, because it's concerned with relationship, and relationship involves, one, what you're relating to and how you do it. Neoplatonism sort of has massive investment in the notion of threeness as a way of understanding the coherence of everything, the coherence of the whole cosmos, the coherence of individuals, the coherence of communities, the coherence of anything, is the key to it is very often, in a Neoplatonic context, the notion of some sort of triad that holds things together. Now, that you could say that is a reflection of the Trinity, but it isn't in Neoplatonism, and it isn't necessarily in Christian writers who make a great deal of triads. I mean, one of my favourite fathers, Dionysius the Areopagite, is full of triads of all sorts of things, all the time, all the place. Hans von Balthasar says in his chapter observes in his chapter on Dionysius that Dionysius never makes any attempt to root these triads in the Trinity. For him, these triads are to do with the characteristic of reality. How this relates to the Trinity is something which he doesn't raise, and when he talks about how the Trinity is a triad, he uses very simple images that you couldn't possibly take seriously. A plant with two roots, as it were, something like that. And that I think is quite deliberate in Dionysius, because if you were to root everything in the Trinity and say all these triads are reflections of the Trinity, you would end up really with a kind of pantheism. And to avoid that, he insists that the ultimate mystery to which everything goes back is indeed the Trinity, but that we cannot conceptualize the Trinity except insofar as saying that for us, as Gregory says, it is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We get to the notion of the Trinity through the idea of God as Father, God as Son, and God as Spirit, which is experienced in the life of the Church and in salvation history. Putting it together is another matter, and there are different ways of doing it. And I would say that a Trinitarian ontology, properly speaking, is one which has an ontology which is triadic and wants to root this in the triadicness of the Trinity. Now, it seems to me that is not the necessary thing to do. I mean, if you're talking about God and participation, I mean, I'll remind you of a criticism of the Orthodox by some Protestant thinkers that using the distinction between essence and energy, or essence and activity, is a way of short-circuiting the doctrine of the Trinity. You don't need a doctrine of the Trinity if you've got a doctrine of ousia and energia. And the notion of participation can, of course, be used in ways that are Trinitarian, but that seems to me to be something that one has to consider. It just seems to me, looking at these questions of ontology in relation to God, that there are even within the Christian tradition, there are a whole variety of ways of looking at things. And I was very struck with what Celia said about it not just being about humans, being about the whole cosmos. Well, this is an emphasis that you find. It's not just a new emphasis. It's there in Maximus, another of my favourite people. Maximus is quite clear that what is achieved in the Transfiguration, for instance, is something that is relevant to the whole cosmos, or to the whole. I think actually he doesn't use the word cosmos there. He uses the whole sympass, the togetherness of everything. Now, these are, it seems to be that I think I really wanted to say that if we're going to think about this, it is a little more complicated than having a model of the Trinity, which we then project onto everything else.
I'm sorry, because my intervention is going to be a step back, because I was answering the question of the interreligious dialogue and the discussion with a Muslim. And I will begin my paper tomorrow with the necessity of really thinking about Trinity especially in the interreligious dialogue. Usually when we are doing interreligious dialogue, and especially with a Muslim, we tend to define the notion of Trinity as describing the being of God. So we are not, we are not endangering the unicity and the simpleness of God. And of course, we have to be very cautious with what we could say comparative theology. But there is indeed an incarnational state in Islam, which is the uncreated status of the Quran. And it's true that it helps to understand that Christian Christ is not so far away, the world is not so far away from the Muslim status of the Quran. Though we have to be careful, of course, when we are doing comparative theology. And it also explains why Muslims relate differently to the Quran than Christians to the Bible. And so that's why I don't like really the word of, the religion of the book, because the book is different from each tradition. But speaking about what is the Quran for a Muslim helps also, I think, maybe to understand not totally, but partly the Christ and the incarnation of Christ for the Christians.
Just a thought, but I think we're talking about interreligious dialogue. We're talking about religions. We're not talking about faith systems, or we oughtn't to be. I don't think starting with faith systems imposes a basically Protestant view of Christianity onto all other religions, and I don't think it's a helpful starting point. I think we should start with the ways in which people live their lives in relation to God. Start at the way people pray, the way people think about how they should behave to other people. All of this sort of thing, it seems to me to be a much more important place to start than saying, well, are there parallels between Christ and the Quran, or are there parallels in some way between Trinitarian glimpses in other religions? That seems to me, that may become important at a later stage, but I think we have to understand a lot more about what it is to, what the way of life inculcated by the different religions is, rather than leaping to conceptual matters.
Professor Vittorio Hösler.
Well, thank you very much for the contribution. I have two remarks to make triggered by what has been said. Why is the concept of person so absent in the discussions that we have till now? Augustine himself in De Trinitate explicitly says that he doesn't like at all the terminus of persona, but accepts it as a translation of a Greek hypostasis. And of course, in the case of Augustine, the main concern is that he doesn't want to be a tritheist. But I think that there is a specific problem that has accrued to the use of person, even if you would imagine only one person, that our concept of personhood, beginning with Kant and particularly strongly with Husserl and Heidegger, is deeply, deeply imbibed with temporality. If we try to understand what a person is, also in Max Scheler, there is this stream of consciousness. And in one thing, Augustine is clear, God is not a temporal being. And I think that is one of the reasons why we are more hesitant with the concept of person today after the temporalization of the philosophical concept of person in the 20th century. The second point that I wanted to make is, when we speak about interreligious dialogue, my personal experience is the immanent Trinity is not the real problem, in the sense that you can easily understand why the absolute principle must have some form of relationality and differentiation in itself. The big problem is how you can identify one of the moments of this immanent Trinity with one concrete historical individual. And if we look at the so-called deists in early modernity, it's a very heterogeneous group of people. And we find a lot among them who have no problem whatsoever with immanent Trinity. But they are very hesitant of identifying one of the three persons with a concrete historical individual. And I think that we should be aware that when we are speaking about Trinitarian ontologies, we may have as a possible project a defense of the immanent Trinity without yet being committed to the further step of identifying one of the persons of the Trinity with a historical individual. Thank you.
So how do we jump over Lessing's ditch? John.
To Vittorio. My question in reply would be, well, how do we know that there is such a Trinity without the economic Trinity? I mean, to use that traditional language, it's by virtue of the economic Trinity and by virtue of Christ and incarnation and so forth, as we might believe it as Christians, that we have any conception whatsoever of the immanent Trinity. So I'm not sure that we can. It seems like a rather abstract hypothesis. But that would be my question back to Vittorio. Okay.
Is this, are you jumping over Lessing's ditch, or is this a different question?
It's a related question.
Okay.
Yes, excuse me.
Thanks. I think, my name is Emily, and I think that the question that was just posed brings up, it for me highlights the scandal of Jesus of Nazareth, and I was hoping to ask, or to remind us about how it was proposed earlier today that apophaticism suggests a strong objection against social Trinitarianism. Apophaticism being a kind of like slow down or a kind of corrective to whenever we try to do something with Trinitarianism. And I was hoping to ask particularly Andrew Louth about the cataphatic part of apophaticism, because oftentimes it's brought up as only the negative aspect. So it's a question about how Christ, for example, can it be apophatic when something as specific as Christ is affirmed?
Apophatic is part of a pair, the other is cataphatic. And I don't know any theologians who think that all theology is apophatic and that there's nothing cataphatic. There are people, I think, who sometimes accuse some kinds of theologians of being altogether too cataphatic and having no apophatic dimension. But it seems to me they go together. And certainly in the understanding of the Orthodox traditions, the understanding of the Orthodox traditions, I understand it, is that they go together, but they don't go together as it were as an equal pair. A great deal is revealed. I mean, both through the incarnation, through creation, through the scriptures, this is revealed. And what is revealed we affirm, which is why we call it cataphatic theology. Now, cataphasis means to affirm something. But the normal way in which it's presented I think in both traditions, throughout Christianity, is that what we affirm of God has been revealed, and we can trust it. But on the other hand, we are conscious of the fact that when we try to use human language of God, we are not at all sure in what sense it really applies. And therefore we have to correct it by saying, well, more fundamentally, we have to deny things of God. But there's no question, I think, of a theology being simply apophatic. You said something about apophatic as opposed to social theory. Well, I mean, my objections to a social theory of the Trinity is not so much the theory itself, is what tends to happen when you have it. That you then tend to think, well, God is Trinity, and the Church is modelled on God, and so it, in some sense, is Trinitarian, and you work out a notion of unity and multiplicity in the Church, or indeed beyond that, unity and multiplicity in society, maybe unity and multiplicity in persons. And you do all this with no reference whatever to Christ, no reference whatever to the cross, because you don't need it. You've got a Trinity up there, which is threefold, and you think you understand it, and then you apply it as if it were solving problems. I don't think it's solving any problems at all. It's just providing you with a convenient way of putting things together. And there, I mean, yes, I would say, I would say that the apophatic strand within Christianity puts a big question mark against using notions that we don't understand to analyze notions that perhaps we understand a bit better.
Maybe it's the moment to add another perspective that is our Trinitarian theology apophatic or cataphatic, but if we take seriously what we develop as a Trinitarian reflection, we will see that we need an apophatic theology of the created world. And this is what is new. And I think this is the real challenge. We need a theology of the secular world, not a theologization of the world, but a theology of the secular world. And this means, and we saw it nearly in all the contributions, that at a certain moment there is a change how we use language and how we speak about God and about the world. And I think we should reflect on this linguistic turn as Bulgakov does, but it's not just a theory of language, it's a way, if I continue to speak in an apophatic way about God and about the world, I need to change the whole habitude, how to speak. And maybe in this way I would continue with the reflections of Johannes Hoff. At this moment, you cannot just say, now I'm speaking apophatic, but you need signs in your existence what it means. So you need moments of listening, of silence, of seeing, of receiving, of prayer, of liturgy. And I think this is what is needed. So, okay.
But you could almost associate the development of secularization with the critique of the doctrine of the Trinity in the West. I mean, Locke's usage of the term person, I mean, Professor Höstler's discussion about linking personhood with temporality is fascinating. But earlier on, you have Locke taking up the concept of a person, which he, of course, famously defines in terms of consciousness. But that is emerging out of a debate in the 1670s, 1680s, 1690s, out of a debate about the doctrine of the Trinity. And that is because of the challenge of Socinianism, of Unitarianism, and of course non-Christian critics of the Trinity. And of course, most modern people would say, well, the doctrine of the Trinity is an instance of the nonsense that is official religion. Doesn't make much sense to them. And I think that has intellectual roots in the 17th century in particular. We have a couple of questions, and we need to bring things to a close. Perhaps one quick question,
Comment.
or a comment.
Question.
Is this a quick comment?
Yeah, it's just a comment on what you just said.
Yeah.
I sometimes wonder whether the scenario you just described is actually reversible in a way. And I've just had a few personal experiences with atheists. So there's a question of interfaith dialogue, but also dialogue with the secular. And I've had remarkable success in actually making ideas about the divine conceivable to people precisely by talking about the Trinity. When people ask me, why do you believe in this God? I say, because of the Trinity. So oddly enough, it's that most mysterious aspect of it which seems to intrigue people, in fact. And I don't know if you have any comments to make on that, but I find it interesting that this abstract Father in the sky becomes much more interesting when you depict him as three in one.
Beautiful thought. Yes. I mean, personally, I find that, as Professor Hedley suggested, the idea of absolute reflexivity highly convincing. The difficulty, it seems to me, is when you come to a defense of the economic Trinity. But obviously, Professor Betz sees things in a rather different way.
Oh, no, I completely want to affirm the immanent Trinity, my goodness, but I don't know if we have recourse to the immanent Trinity apart from the economy. That's all I really wanted to say.
Well, perhaps on that apophatic note, we should thank our speakers and our audience for a stimulating...
Thank you for moderating.
Thank you, Dr.